The rain had been falling since sundown, and it showed no sign of stopping. Duke Vane of Amsel sat inside his private carriage with his jaw clenched and his gloves still on. The meeting at the royal vaults had gone exactly as he had feared. 3 hours of sitting across from bankers who smiled with their mouths and threatened with their eyes. 3 hours of hearing the same answer dressed in different words. "Your Grace, the debts are binding. The documents carry your late father's signature. Amsel Manor will be seized by the quarter's end unless full repayment is made." Vane pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. Full repayment. £40,000. A sum so enormous it could buy 3 ships and still leave change for a country house. His father had been many things. Proud, stubborn, and far too trusting. But a man who would mortgage his own ancestral home to a lending syndicate? That part had never made sense to Vane. The signature on those bonds looked right. The seal looked right. But something in his gut told him the whole arrangement was rotten from the inside out. He rapped his knuckles twice against the ceiling panel. "Take us north, Hargreaves. Bramble Inn. We'll rest the horses there." "Very good, Your Grace," came the muffled reply from the driver's bench above. The carriage lurched forward over the wet cobblestones. Oakhaven's market district was empty at this hour, its stalls shuttered, its lanterns swinging on iron hooks in the wind. The only sounds were the clatter of hooves and the drumming of rain against the lacquered roof. Vane had just closed his eyes when the carriage door flew open. Cold air rushed in. Rain spattered across the leather seat, and before Vane could reach for the handle or shout for his driver, a figure in a dark velvet cloak threw itself inside, pulling the door shut behind it with a sharp click. The figure pressed flat against the far seat, knees drawn up, hood pulled low. Vane could see nothing of the face beneath the fabric. Only a pair of gloved hands gripping the edge of the cushion as if the carriage itself might try to throw them out. "Who the devil are you?" Vane's voice came out harder than he intended. His hand instinctively moved to the small compartment beneath his seat where he kept a walking cane with a weighted brass handle. The figure raised one hand, a plea for silence, and then a voice came from beneath the hood. A woman's voice. Tight with fear, but steady enough to form words. Please pretend I'm your wife." Vane stared at her. Before he could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed from somewhere close behind the carriage. Shouts followed, sharp and commanding. "Check that one! The black carriage near the alley!" Lantern light swept across the window. Vane caught a flash of dark uniforms through the rain-streaked glass. He recognized the insignia instantly, the double-barred crest of Baron Sterling's private bank guard. These were not constables. These were hired men, paid by one of the wealthiest and most dangerous financiers in England. The boots stopped outside the carriage door. 3 hard knocks rattled the panel. "Open up! Private security detail for the royal vaults. We're searching all vehicles leaving the district." Vane looked at the woman. She had pressed herself deeper into the corner of the seat, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. Her eyes were visible now, dark and wide, and locked onto his with an intensity that asked everything without saying another word. He had about 4 seconds to decide. Vane reached across the carriage and pulled the heavy wool traveling blanket from the storage shelf. He tossed it over the woman's lap and legs, covering the mud on her boots and the damp hem of her cloak. Then he straightened his collar, adjusted his cufflinks, and opened the door himself. The guard captain stood on the cobblestones with a lantern raised. 2 men flanked him, hands resting on the short clubs at their belts. Rain dripped from the brim of the captain's hat as he squinted into the carriage's interior. "State your name and business, sir." Vane stepped halfway out, positioning his body so the door frame partially shielded the woman from view. He let his voice settle into the low, unhurried tone that came naturally to men who had spent their entire lives giving orders. "I am the Duke of Amsel, and you are standing in my reign." The captain's expression shifted. He glanced at the carriage's side panel where the Amsel family crest was painted in gold, a stag's head above two crossed swords. "Your Grace, apologies. We're looking for a woman, dark cloak, seen running from the district about 10 minutes past." Vane raised one eyebrow. "A woman? Running? In this weather?" "She was seen near the Sterling Vault offices, Your Grace. Possible theft." "How unfortunate for Baron Sterling." Vane let a thin smile cross his face. "As you can see, the only woman in my carriage is my wife, who has had rather too much claret at dinner and is presently sleeping off the consequences. I would prefer not to wake her. She becomes quite disagreeable when disturbed." The captain leaned slightly to one side, trying to peer past Vane. Inside the carriage, the woman had her head tilted back against the seat, with her eyes closed and the blanket drawn up to her chin. To anyone looking in from outside, on a dark and rainy night, she looked exactly like a dozing duchess who had enjoyed one glass too many. The captain hesitated. Then he straightened up and touched the brim of his hat. "Of course, Your Grace. Our apologies for the inconvenience. Safe travels." Vane gave a single nod, stepped back inside, and pulled the door shut. He rapped the ceiling twice. The carriage jolted forward and rolled out of the alley, past the line of guards, and onto the northern road leading away from Oakhaven. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. The woman sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders. She pushed back her hood, and for the first time, Vane saw her face clearly in the faint glow of the carriage's interior lantern. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 25, with sharp features, damp brown hair pulled back in a loose knot, and an expression that carried equal parts relief and calculation. She exhaled. Then she reached inside her cloak and withdrew something that caught the lantern light. It was a key, ornate, double-bitted, forged from dark iron, with a handle shaped like a serpent coiling around a shield. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You just helped me steal the one thing that can destroy Baron Sterling." Vane looked at the key. Then he looked at her. "You had better start talking," he said. "And you had better make it very convincing." The carriage rolled on through the rain, carrying two strangers deeper into the night, and straight toward a secret that would shake the foundations of England's most powerful lending empire. Dawn came gray and reluctant, as if the sky itself hadn't decided whether the night was truly over. The Bramble Inn sat 5 miles north of Oakhaven, on a stretch of road that saw more sheep than travelers. It was the sort of place where the innkeeper asked no questions as long as you paid in coin and didn't break the furniture. Hargreaves had pulled the carriage around to the rear stable yard, where a boy of about 12 was already unhitching the tired horses and leading them toward water troughs. Vane had not slept. He had spent the entire journey watching the woman sitting across from him, who had said almost nothing since her initial revelation. She had tucked the serpent key back inside her cloak and sat with her hands folded, staring out the window as if she were counting every mile between herself and Oakhaven. Now, inside the inn's cramped private lounge, a low-ceilinged room with a coal fire and 2 mismatched armchairs, Vane poured himself a cup of tea from the pot the innkeeper's wife had left on a side table and set a second cup across from him. "Sit," he said, "and talk." Sylvia sat. She did not touch the tea. "My name is Sylvia Hartwell," she began. "My father was George Hartwell. He was a master engraver in Cheapside. He made seals, printing plates, banknote engravings, anything that required precision metalwork. I apprenticed under him from the age of 13. Vane leaned back in his chair. "An engraver's daughter. That explains how you managed to get your hands on a vault key without setting off every alarm in the building." "I didn't steal it from the vault," Sylvia said. "I made a copy. 3 months ago, I took a position as a cleaning woman at Sterling's offices in Oakhaven. I scrubbed floors and polished brass fittings, and nobody looked at me twice. I spent 11 weeks studying the movements of the guards, the schedules of the clerks, and the exact shape of the master key that the vault manager carried on a chain around his neck.
You copied it from sight?
From memory. An engraver's eye holds shape the way a musician's ear holds pitch. I watched that key every day for weeks,
Studied every tooth and ridge, and cast the duplicate in my father's old workshop using his tools.
Vane set down his teacup. That's a remarkable skill. It's also a hanging offense if you're caught. So the question remains, why? Why risk your neck to break into the private ledger room of the most dangerous financier in the south of England? Sylvia's jaw tightened. She looked at the fire for a long moment before answering.
Because Sterling destroyed my family. 4 years ago, my father took a small loan from Sterling's syndicate to expand his workshop. The terms seemed fair, the interest was manageable. But 6 months into the arrangement, Sterling's men produced a second contract, one my father had never signed, claiming the loan had been restructured at triple the original rate. When my father protested, they threatened him with debtor's prison. He sold the workshop, the tools, everything he had built over 30 years. It finished him. He died 14 months later in a boarding house in Southwark, with nothing to his name. The room was quiet except for the crack and hiss of the fire.
The loan documents were forged, Sylvia continued. I knew it then, and I know it now. My father's hand was steady as a surgeon's. The signature on that second contract had a tremor in the downstroke that he would never have made. But we had no proof. Sterling's original ledgers, the real ones, the ones that show the true terms of every loan he has ever issued, are locked inside a private chamber beneath his country estate. That key opens the outer door, and inside those ledgers is the evidence that Sterling has been forging debt bonds for over 20 years. Vane felt something cold settle in his chest. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grey morning and the horses drinking in the yard. 20 years, he repeated quietly.
At least. My father was one of dozens, possibly hundreds. Sterling targets families who are respectable enough to have assets worth seizing, but not powerful enough to fight back through the courts. He lends at fair terms, waits until the borrower is dependent, then produces falsified contracts with crushing interest. When they can't pay, he takes everything. Vane turned from the window. My father borrowed from Sterling's syndicate in the year before he died. The estate has been served with foreclosure papers dated for the end of this quarter. £40,000 in outstanding debt, all of it supposedly secured against Amsel Manor. Sylvia looked up at him.
And did your father sign those terms willingly?
My father would sooner have burned the house to the ground than pledged it to a moneylender. He was proud to the point of foolishness. The signatures on those bonds have haunted me for 2 years because they look genuine, and yet everything about the arrangement feels wrong.
They will be in the ledger, Sylvia said. Every original contract, every forged duplicate, every record of what was actually agreed and what was later fabricated. Sterling keeps meticulous records because he uses them to protect himself against his own associates. If we reach that vault and open it, your estate papers will be there alongside my father's, alongside all of them.
Vane was quiet for a long time. He studied her face across the dim room, looking for any trace of dishonesty, any hint that this woman was running a scheme of her own. What he found instead was exhaustion, determination, and the kind of grief that doesn't fade. It just hardens into something functional. You have the key, he said slowly. But you still need a way inside Sterling's estate. A cleaning woman from Cheapside cannot walk through the front door of a baron's country house.
No, Sylvia agreed, but a duchess can.
The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water.
Sterling is holding his annual grand antique auction at his estate in 4 days,
she said.
Every titled family in the southern counties will be there. I need someone with a name, a crest, and a carriage grand enough to get me through those gates without a second glance.
Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he extended his hand across the space between their chairs. Then we have a partnership, Miss Hartwell. Sylvia took his hand and shook it once, firmly. We have a partnership, Your Grace. Outside, Hargreaves finished loading the fresh horses into their harnesses, and the carriage stood waiting in the pale morning light, pointed north. They had been on the road for 3 hours when Hargreaves slowed the carriage without warning. Vane opened the small sliding panel behind the driver's bench. "What is it?" "Checkpoint ahead, Your Grace. Blackwood River Bridge. There's a line of carts and carriages backed up along the road, and I can see armed men on the crossing." Vane closed the panel and looked at Sylvia, who had been sitting with the serpent key hidden inside a stitched pocket she had sewn into the lining of her cloak during the ride. She moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The Blackwood River was a wide, sluggish stretch of brown water that marked the boundary between the southern counties and the rural Midlands. A single wooden toll bridge spanned it, wide enough for one carriage at a time. Under normal circumstances, the bridge was managed by a sleepy toll collector who charged a penny per axle and waved travelers through without a glance. Today was different. 6 men stood at the bridge's entrance, and they were not toll collectors. They wore dark coats with brass buttons and carried short-barreled pistols holstered at their hips. At the center of the group stood a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a leather dispatch case tucked under one arm. He was stopping each vehicle, speaking with the driver, and in some cases ordering passengers to step out for inspection.
"Sterling's men,"
Sylvia said, pulling back from the window.
"Private mercenaries. He keeps a standing company of about 40. They handle debt collections, property seizures, and, apparently, roadblocks."
"A baron running his own private militia," Vane muttered. "The man fancies himself a feudal lord."
"He's worse than that. He's a feudal lord with a banking license."
Vane watched the checkpoint through the glass. 2 carriages ahead of them, a merchant's wagon was being thoroughly searched. The mercenaries were pulling back canvas covers and checking beneath seats, while the merchant stood at the roadside looking furious and helpless in equal measure.
"We could turn back," Sylvia said. "Find another crossing further east."
"The next bridge is at Thornbury, 12 miles downstream. If Sterling has men here, he'll have men there too. And every hour we spend circling around is another hour for him to tighten the net." Vane straightened in his seat and adjusted his cravat. "We go through, as planned." Sylvia's expression flickered with something between admiration and anxiety.
"You're certain your rank will be enough?"
"My rank has opened every door I've ever walked through. The trick is making sure you look like you belong on the other side of it." He paused and looked her over with a critical eye. "Take off the cloak."
"What?"
"The cloak. It's soaked, it's mud-stained, and it makes you look like someone who's been running through back alleys in the middle of the night, which is precisely what you were doing. Underneath, what are you wearing?" Sylvia unfastened the clasp and let the velvet cloak fall behind her shoulders. Beneath it, she wore a simple gray traveling dress with a high neckline and long sleeves. It was plain, but it was clean, well-fitted, and made from decent wool. "That will do," Vane said. He reached into the storage compartment beneath his seat and withdrew a small leather case. Inside was a pearl brooch that had belonged to his mother, an oval of lustrous white set in a silver filigree frame. He held it out to Sylvia. "Pin this at your collar. A duchess traveling without jewelry raises more suspicion than a duchess traveling without a maid." Sylvia took the brooch carefully. She turned it over in her fingers, studying the craftsmanship the way only someone trained in fine metalwork would. Then she pinned it neatly at the base of her throat and folded her hands in her lap. The transformation was remarkable. With her back straight, her chin lifted, and the pearl catching the gray daylight from the window,
She could have stepped out of any drawing room in Mayfair.
The carriage rolled forward. They were next. Vane heard Hargreaves exchange words with someone outside, and then the broad-shouldered captain appeared at the carriage window, bending down to look inside. His eyes moved quickly, across Vane's face, across Sylvia's posture, across the interior of the carriage. "Good afternoon," the captain said. His accent was from somewhere in the north, Lancashire, perhaps. "Routine inspection on behalf of the Sterling Financial Trust. May I ask your name and destination, sir?" Vane let a beat of silence pass before answering. The kind of silence that said he was not accustomed to being questioned on a public road by a man in a mercenary's coat. "I am the Duke of Amsel. This is my wife, the Duchess. We are returning to our estate from a seaside holiday in Lyme Regis, and I must say, I find it extraordinary that a private financial company believes it has the authority to blockade a crown highway." The captain's posture shifted. He stood a fraction straighter, and his tone softened by several degrees. "Apologies, Your Grace. We've had a theft reported from one of the Trust's offices in Oakhaven. A woman. We're checking all northbound traffic as a precaution." "A woman stole from Baron Sterling?" Vane allowed a thin, amused smile to cross his face. He glanced sideways at Sylvia. "Darling, did you hear that? A woman robbed a bank. How wonderfully scandalous." Sylvia turned her head toward the captain with exactly the right expression. Polite interest layered over aristocratic boredom. "How dreadful for the Baron. I do hope he recovers whatever was taken. These things can be so distressing." Her voice had changed. The vowels were rounder, the consonants softer, and the rhythm carried the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her life worried about money. It was a perfect imitation of the kind of woman who summered at country estates and wintered in Bath, and it landed with absolute precision. The captain glanced between them once more. His gaze lingered for half a second on the pearl brooch at Sylvia's collar, then moved to the Amsel crest painted on the carriage door. "Of course, Your Grace. My apologies for the delay. You're free to pass." He stepped back and waved them through. Hargreaves guided the horses onto the bridge, and the wooden planks groaned beneath the carriage wheels as they crossed the river. Sylvia did not breathe until they reached the far bank, and the road curved away into a corridor of elm trees that hid the checkpoint from view. "Well," Vane said, settling back into his seat, "that answers one question." "Which question?" "Whether you can play a duchess convincingly enough to fool a room full of aristocrats." He paused. "You can." Sylvia unpinned the brooch and held it out to him. Vane shook his head. "Keep it on. We have a long way to go, and there may be more checkpoints. From this moment until the auction is over, you are the Duchess of Amsel. The cloak stays off, the brooch stays on, and if anyone asks, we have been married for 2 years, and you find the countryside terribly dull." Sylvia looked at him, then at the brooch, then back at the road stretching ahead through the elms. 2 years, she said. "And what sort of husband have you been, Your Grace?" "Distant, preoccupied, and overly fond of my hunting dogs. The usual." Something close to a smile crossed Sylvia's face. She pinned the brooch back in place and settled against the seat as the carriage pressed on northward, deeper into the English Midlands, and closer to the estate of the man who had ruined both their families. The afternoon light was fading when Hargreaves steered the carriage off the main road and onto a narrow lane that cut through a thicket of blackthorn and wild hazel. Vane had made the decision an hour earlier, after Sylvia spotted a pair of riders trailing them at a distance of about half a mile. They appeared twice on straight stretches of road, maintaining the same gap each time, and then vanished whenever the carriage rounded a bend. It could have been coincidence. 2 travelers heading in the same direction at the same pace, but Vane had survived long enough in the world of English aristocracy to know that coincidence was just a word people used when they didn't want to admit someone was watching them. "There's a place ahead," Hargreaves had said through the panel. "Old glassworks outside Millfield Village.
Closed down 8 or 9 years ago when the owner went bankrupt. Courtyard's big enough for the carriage, and the walls will hide us from the road.
The lane narrowed further, branches scraping against the sides of the carriage, until it opened into a walled yard overgrown with dock leaves and nettles.
The glassworks rose behind it, a long, low building of blackened brick with a tall chimney that had lost its top section to weather or neglect. Half the windows were shattered. The rest were dark with grime. Hargreaves brought the horses to a stop and began unhitching them to rest. Vane helped Sylvia down from the carriage step, and together they walked through a warped doorway into what had once been the foreman's office. The room still had a desk, a stool, and a cast-iron stove with a chimney pipe that ran crookedly up through the ceiling. Dust covered every surface like gray velvet. Vane checked the stove's flue, found it clear enough, and built a small fire using broken chair legs stacked in one corner. The wood was dry and caught quickly, and within minutes the room had a fragile warmth that pushed back the damp evening air. Sylvia sat on the edge of the desk and pulled the serpent key from its hidden pocket. She held it up to the firelight, turning it slowly. "We need to talk about what happens when we get inside Sterling's vault," she said. Vane settled onto the stool across from her. "I assumed we'd use the key, take the ledger, and leave."
If it were that simple,
I wouldn't have needed a duke.
The key opens the outer door of the vault chamber, but Sterling had the entire locking mechanism redesigned 18 months ago by a firm in Birmingham. The new system has 2 stages. The outer door requires this key. The inner lock, the one protecting the ledger cabinet itself, requires a secondary bypass combination, a sequence of numbers that rotates the tumblers in the correct order. Vane frowned. "And you don't have this combination?" "I know it exists. I know Sterling keeps it written down because the sequence is too long to memorize reliably. But I don't know where he stores it." "Then we have a problem." "We have half a problem. I know someone who might be able to tell us where Sterling keeps the cipher, a retired locksmith in Kingsport named Fenton. He was one of the contractors who installed the original vault system at Sterling Manor 15 years ago, before the redesign. He owes me a favor. My father once repaired a set of engraving plates for him without charging a penny, and Fenton is the sort of man who remembers debts like that." Vane considered this. "Kingsport is a full day's ride east. That costs us time." "It costs us 1 day. If we skip it and go straight to Sterling Manor without the combination, we'll get through the outer door and then stand there staring at a second lock we cannot open. That costs us everything." She was right, and Vane knew it. He watched the firelight play across the surface of the key, catching the serpent's tiny forged scales and the ridges of the double-bitted teeth. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each tooth filed to a precision that most professional locksmiths would struggle to match. "You made this entirely from memory," he said. "No wax impression, no tracing, no mold." Sylvia nodded. 11 weeks of observation. Every morning when the vault manager unlocked the main office, he would lift the key from inside his waistcoat and hold it in front of him for about 4 seconds while he found the lock. 4 seconds, 5 days a week, for 11 weeks. I memorized it in segments. The handle first, then the shaft, then each tooth from left to right. When I had the complete picture fixed in my mind, I cast it over 3 nights in my father's workshop. "Your father taught you well." "My father taught me that precision is a form of honesty. Every line means something. Every measurement tells the truth. That's why he could never have signed Sterling's forged contracts. His hand didn't lie, and neither did his work." The fire popped and sent a spray of orange sparks up the flue. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the broken windows of the main glassworks hall.
Vane leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees.
"Here is what I propose. Tomorrow we travel to Kingsport and speak to your locksmith. We get the location of the bypass cipher. Then we make our way to Sterling Manor in time for the auction on the 4th day. I'll handle the social performance, the introductions, the conversations, the distractions. You handle the vault.
And if something goes wrong inside the estate?
Then we improvise. I've spent my entire adult life attending events where half the room wants something from me and the other half wants to ruin me. Sterling's auction will be no different. Sylvia studied him for a moment.
You're risking a great deal, Your Grace. If we're caught inside that vault, your title won't protect you. Sterling will make certain of that.
My title is the only thing I have left, Miss Hartwell. In 60 days, it won't matter anyway, because Sterling will own my home, my land, and every acre my family has held for 3 generations. So yes, I am risking a great deal, because I have a great deal to lose, and very little time left to lose it in. Sylvia held his gaze, and something shifted in her expression. The careful distance she had maintained since climbing into his carriage began to thin, replaced by something closer to genuine trust. She slid the key back into its hidden pocket and stood up from the desk.
Then we should sleep while we can. Tomorrow will be a long day, and Kingsport's docks are no place for tired minds.
Vane arranged the carriage blankets into makeshift bedding on the floor near the stove, while Sylvia took the desk side of the room. Hargreaves stayed with the horses in the stable yard, keeping watch from the driver's bench, with a lantern dimmed to a low glow. The fire burned down slowly through the night, and the old glasswork settled around them with the groans and whispers of a building that had long forgotten the heat of its furnaces. Somewhere on the road beyond the thicket, the 2 riders, if they had been real, were gone. But Sterling's reach was long, and Kingsport was still a full day's ride away. Kingsport smelled of salt, tar, and fish guts. The town sat on a crescent-shaped harbor where merchant vessels from France, Holland, and the Baltic states unloaded their cargo onto stone quays, stained dark with decades of spilled oil and seawater. Gulls screamed overhead in constant argument, and the streets closest to the docks were packed tight with sailors, traders, customs clerks, and women selling hot pies from wooden trays strapped around their necks. Vane had left the carriage at a coaching inn on the town's western edge, where Hargreaves could rest properly and the horses could be stabled out of sight. He and Sylvia walked the remaining quarter-mile into the commercial district on foot, moving through crowds thick enough that 2 well-dressed strangers drew no particular attention. The Guildhall Exchange was a broad 3-story building of Portland stone that overlooked the main quay. Its ground floor served as a trading hall where shipping contracts were negotiated over long oak tables, and its upper floors housed the offices of notaries, maritime insurers, and the sort of men who made their living in the gray spaces between legal commerce and everything else. Sylvia led Vane up a narrow staircase at the back of the building to a door on the 2nd floor. The brass nameplate read, T. Fenton, Consulting Engineer. She knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times more. A bolt slid back. The door opened to reveal a wiry man in his 60s with deep-set eyes, ink-stained fingers, and a leather apron worn over a collarless shirt. He looked at Sylvia for a long second, then at Vane, then back at Sylvia. "George Hartwell's girl," he said. His voice carried the rough edges of a man who had spent decades working with metal files and grinding wheels. "I heard what happened to your father. Rotten business. Come in." The office was small and crammed with the tools of Fenton's trade. Workbenches lined 2 walls, covered with disassembled lock mechanisms, coils of steel wire, and magnifying lenses mounted on adjustable brass arms. A large technical drawing was pinned to a board above the fireplace, a cross-section of a vault door showing the arrangement of internal tumblers and spring mechanisms. Fenton cleared a stack of trade journals from 2 chairs and gestured for them to sit. He did not offer tea or pleasantries. He was the kind of man who understood that people who knocked with a coded pattern at his door were rarely making social calls. "I need information about Sterling Manor," Sylvia said.
specifically about the vault beneath the east wing.
Fenton's expression tightened. He sat down on his work stool and folded his arms. I built the original vault system for Sterling 15 years ago. 8-lever tumbler lock, reinforced iron door, stone-lined chamber. Good, honest work. Then about 18 months back, he brought in a firm from Birmingham to redesign the whole thing. Didn't tell me why, didn't ask my opinion. Just sent a letter saying my services were no longer required. Do you know what they changed? I know exactly what they changed, because I still have contacts in the trade who talk after a few drinks. They added a second-stage lock to the inner cabinet. The outer door still uses a master key, same keyhole, same mechanism I installed. But the cabinet inside now requires a bypass combination, a rotating cipher, 12 digits, that has to be entered in the correct sequence on a numbered dial. Sylvia leaned forward.
Do you know the combination?
No, Sterling changes it every quarter. The current sequence will be known only to him and possibly one trusted clerk.
Then where does he keep it written down?
Fenton rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at the technical drawing above the fireplace. Sterling is a careful man, but he's also a vain one. He doesn't trust banks, ironic considering his profession, and he doesn't trust his own staff beyond a certain point. He keeps all sensitive documents on his person or inside his private traveling coach. The coach has a hidden compartment built into the left side panel, behind the leather upholstery. I know this because I designed the compartment myself, years ago, when Sterling still considered me useful. Vane spoke for the first time. You're saying the bypass combination is inside Sterling's personal carriage? I'm saying that's where he keeps everything he doesn't want anyone else to find. Letters, financial summaries, cipher keys. The compartment is lined with oilskin to protect the contents from damp, and the release mechanism is a small brass catch disguised as an upholstery stud, third stud from the top on the left interior panel. Sylvia and Vane exchanged a glance. The information was precise, specific, and completely useless unless they could get close to Sterling's coach without being seen. There's something else you should know, Fenton said. He stood and walked to his workbench, pulling open a drawer and withdrawing a folded sheet of paper. Sterling's auction is in 2 days. Every locksmith and security contractor in the southern counties has been sent one of these. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the bench. It was a printed notice bearing Sterling's personal seal, the same double-barred crest worn by his guards at the Blackwood River checkpoint. The text offered a reward of £500 for information leading to the recovery of a stolen item described only as a key of unique design, property of the Sterling Financial Trust. £500. More than most families earned in 5 years. Every tradesman between London and Bristol has seen this notice, Fenton said. If anyone spots that key of yours, they'll sell you out for a fraction of that reward and still count themselves lucky. Sylvia's hand moved instinctively to the hidden pocket in her cloak lining. The key was still there, its weight a constant pressure against her ribs. "Can you tell anyone we were here?" Vane asked, watching Fenton's face carefully. The old locksmith met his gaze without flinching. "George Hartwell was the finest engraver I ever knew, and Sterling's people ground him into dust. His daughter comes to my door asking for help, and you want to know if I'll betray her for money?" He folded the reward notice in half and dropped it into the fireplace, where it curled and blackened in the coals. "Get into that vault, find those ledgers, and burn Sterling the way he burned everyone else." Sylvia stood and took the old man's ink-stained hand in both of hers. No words passed between them, but the understanding was clear. Outside, the Kingsport docks churned with afternoon activity. Vane and Sylvia walked back toward the coaching inn through streets that felt more dangerous now that they knew Sterling's reward notice was circulating in every workshop and tavern in the south.
"Third stud from the top,"
Sylvia murmured as they walked.
"Left interior panel."
"We'll need to get close to his coach," Vane said. which means we need to know where Sterling will be before the auction.
He travels to his estate a day early every year. He always stops at the same way station on Foxglove Hill to change horses and dine.
Vane looked at her. And how do you know that?
Because I've spent 3 months learning everything about that man's habits, his schedule, and his vanity. I know where he eats, where he rests, and which coat he wears on Thursdays. She paused. You study a lock before you pick it, Your Grace. Sterling is just a lock with a title.
They reached the coaching inn as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the harbor. Hargreaves had the fresh horses ready and the carriage pointed east, toward Foxglove Hill and the most dangerous part of the plan. The fog arrived before they did. It rolled in from the lowlands like something alive, filling the hollows between the hills and swallowing the hedgerows on both sides of the road. By the time Hargreaves guided the carriage up the long slope toward Foxglove Hill, the world had shrunk to a circle of about 30 feet in every direction, and the lanterns mounted on the carriage frame threw pale yellow cones into a wall of gray. The way station sat at the crest of the hill, a stone coaching house with a thatched roof, a dining parlor, and a stable block that could hold a dozen horses. It was one of those places that existed purely because the road demanded it. Travelers heading east toward the great country estates of Buckinghamshire needed somewhere to change horses and eat a hot meal before the final push, and the Foxglove had served that purpose for the better part of a century. Vane saw Sterling's carriage the moment they entered the yard. It was impossible to miss. A large, gleaming black coach with gilt trim and the double-barred crest painted on both doors parked at the far end of the stable block with its team of 4 bay horses still in harness. A coachman sat on the driver's bench, half asleep with a wool blanket pulled around his shoulders and a clay pipe gone cold between his teeth.
That's it,
Sylvia said from beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. She was staring at the coach through the carriage window with an intensity that reminded Vane of a cat watching a mouse hole. Vane made a quick assessment. Sterling's coachman was dozing. No guards were visible in the yard. The fog reduced visibility to almost nothing beyond the immediate area around the coaching house. If Sterling was inside the dining parlor, his coach would be unattended except for the sleeping driver. Here is what we do, Vane said. I go inside and find Sterling. I engage him in conversation and keep him occupied for as long as you need. You wait until the yard is clear, then get to the coach, find the compartment, and copy the cipher.
And if the coachman wakes up?
The coachman has been sitting in cold fog for what looks like at least an hour. He'll need to eat eventually. When I go inside, I'll have the innkeeper send a plate out to the stable hands. He'll leave the bench to collect it, and that gives you your window. Sylvia nodded.
I'll need a pencil and paper to copy the sequence. A 12-digit cipher is too long to trust to memory alone.
Vane reached into his coat pocket and produced a small notebook and a graphite pencil, the kind to use to make notes during financial meetings. He handed them to her without a word. They stepped down from the carriage on opposite sides. Sylvia moved into the fog along the stable wall, disappearing within seconds. Vane straightened his coat, adjusted his cravat, and walked through the front door of the way station as if he owned it. The dining parlor was warm and smelled of roasted mutton and boiled potatoes. A fire burned in a stone hearth large enough to stand inside, and half a dozen travelers sat at wooden tables with plates and tankards in front of them. Vane scanned the room and found Baron Sterling immediately. He was sitting alone at a corner table near the window, eating a chop with a knife and fork and reading a folded newspaper. Sterling was a man of about 55, tall and lean, with gray hair combed straight back from a high forehead and a face that looked like it had been assembled from angles rather than curves. Everything about him was sharp. His cheekbones, his jaw,
his pale blue eyes that moved with the quick, measuring quality of a man who calculated the value of everything he looked at.
Vane crossed the room and stopped beside Sterling's table with the easy confidence of a man greeting an acquaintance at his own club.
"Baron Sterling, what a fortunate crossing. I've been meaning to write to your offices for weeks."
Sterling looked up from his newspaper. Recognition passed across his face. He knew the Duke of Amsel by reputation, if nothing else, and he set down his knife with the careful precision of someone who never made careless movements.
"Your Grace, an unexpected pleasure. Please, sit."
Vane sat. He ordered a glass of port from the serving girl and launched into the conversation he had been rehearsing in his mind since Kingsport. "I wanted to discuss the terms of my family's outstanding obligations with your trust," Vane began, keeping his tone measured and businesslike. "The foreclosure deadline is approaching, and I wondered whether there might be room for a restructured arrangement. An extension of terms, perhaps, in exchange for a partial payment against the principal."
Sterling's expression shifted into something that resembled sympathy but carried no warmth behind it. "Your Grace, I have always admired the Amsel family's commitment to their ancestral holdings. But business is business. The documents are clear, the debts are binding, and the quarter's deadline is fixed by contract. I'm afraid my hands are tied." Vane allowed a flicker of frustration to cross his face, just enough to seem genuine.
"Surely there is some flexibility. We are talking about an estate that has been in my family for 3 generations.
And I have every respect for that legacy. But respect does not pay outstanding balances."
"Your Grace." They went back and forth across the table for 20 minutes, Vane probing and Sterling deflecting with the practiced ease of a man who had conducted 1,000 such conversations and won every single one. Vane did not care about the outcome of the discussion. Every minute Sterling spent explaining the inflexibility of his lending terms was a minute Sylvia had alone with his carriage. Through the parlor window, Vane caught a brief glimpse of movement in the fog. The coachman had climbed down from the bench and was walking toward the kitchen door at the side of the building, where the innkeeper's boy was holding out a covered plate. The bench was empty. The carriage was unguarded. Vane kept talking. Outside, Sylvia moved through the fog like a shadow. She reached Sterling's coach and tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Coachmen rarely bothered securing a vehicle when their master was 50 feet away. She climbed inside and pulled the door shut behind her, leaving it open just a crack so the latch wouldn't click. The interior was dark, but her hands knew what they were looking for. Left side panel. Leather upholstery held in place with brass studs arranged in vertical rows. She counted from the top. First stud, second stud, third stud. She pressed it firmly and felt it give way with a faint metallic snap. A narrow panel swung open behind the leather, revealing a slim compartment lined with oilskin, exactly as Fenton had described. Inside were 3 folded documents and a small card of thick cream paper. Sylvia pulled out the card and held it close to her face in the dim light that seeped through the coach windows. 12 digits, written in a tight, precise hand. The bypass cipher. She copied the sequence into Vane's notebook with quick, steady strokes, replaced the card exactly as she had found it, pressed the brass stud back into position, and slipped out of the coach into the fog. By the time Vane finished his port and bid Sterling a cordial good evening, Sylvia was already waiting beside their own carriage, with the notebook tucked inside her sleeve and the ghost of a smile on her face. Vane climbed in beside her. Hargreaves drove them out of the way-station yard and onto the eastbound road without a backward glance. "Did you get it?" Vane asked. Sylvia opened the notebook and held it out to him. 12 digits in her careful hand. "We have everything we need," she said. "The key and the cipher. All that's left is the vault itself." The fog closed behind them as the carriage descended the far side of Foxglove Hill, carrying them towards Stirling Manor, and the most dangerous night of their lives.
Stirling Manor announced itself a full mile before they reached the gates. The estate sat on a rise of land above the Buckinghamshire countryside, like a stone crown placed upon a green head. 3 stories of honey-coloured limestone, rows of tall windows blazing with candlelight, and a central portico supported by 4 columns thick enough to hide behind. The drive leading up to the house was lined with torches, set into iron holders at 10-foot intervals, each one throwing a circle of flickering gold across the gravel. Carriages were arriving in a steady procession. Vane counted at least 15 ahead of them in the queue, each one polished to a high shine and bearing the crests of families whose names appeared in every society column and parliamentary register in England. Earls, viscounts, baronets, and at least 2 marquises by the look of the livery on their footmen. Stirling's annual Grand Antique Auction was the social event of the autumn calendar, and anyone who mattered, or wanted to be seen as someone who mattered, made certain they attended. Sylvia sat beside Vane in silence, watching the procession through the window.
She had spent the previous day preparing for this moment with a thoroughness that impressed him.
At a dressmaker's shop in the village of Marlow, she had purchased a gown of deep midnight blue silk with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs, paid for with money Vane provided without hesitation. Her hair was pinned up in a style she had copied from a portrait of a countess hanging in the shop's fitting room, and the pearl brooch sat at her throat as if it had always belonged there. She looked every inch a duchess. The question was whether she could sustain the performance for an entire evening in a room full of people who had been born into the roles she was imitating.
"Remember," Vane said as their carriage moved closer to the entrance.
"You are the Duchess of Amsel. We married 2 years ago in a private ceremony at the family chapel. You prefer watercolor painting to embroidery, you find London society exhausting, and you have a mild opinion about everything and a strong opinion about nothing. The less you say, the more they'll assume you're important."
And if someone asks me a direct question I cannot answer?
Smile, take a sip of champagne, and say you find the subject terribly fascinating, but you wouldn't dream of boring the company with your own views. It works for half the duchesses in England. The carriage reached the portico. A footman in Stirling's livery, dark green coat with gold braid, opened the door and lowered the step. Vane descended first and offered his hand to Sylvia. She took it and stepped down onto the gravel with a composure that betrayed nothing of the nerves she must have been feeling.
The grand foyer was a cathedral of wealth. A marble floor in black and white checkerboard pattern stretched from the entrance to a sweeping double staircase. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling at intervals, each one holding 40 or 50 candles whose combined light turned the room bright as noon. Enormous oil paintings in gilded frames covered the walls, landscapes, hunting scenes, and portraits of Stirling ancestors who stared down at the arriving guests with expressions of permanent disapproval. A butler standing at the base of the staircase announced each guest as they entered. Vane handed over his card, and the butler's voice rang out across the foyer. "His Grace the Duke of Amsel. Her Grace the Duchess of Amsel." Heads turned, conversations paused. Vane felt the weight of dozens of eyes moving across them as they descended the 3 shallow steps into the main reception area. He placed Sylvia's hand on his arm and walked forward at an unhurried pace, nodding to acquaintances and offering the practiced half-smile that aristocratic men deployed at social functions like a shield. Stirling appeared within minutes. He crossed the foyer with a glass of claret in one hand and the other extended in greeting, his sharp face arranged into an expression of warm hospitality that sat on his features like a borrowed coat. "Your Grace, I had no idea you would be attending this year. And this must be the Duchess. I confess, I was not aware you had married." "A quiet affair," Vane said smoothly. "My wife values her privacy. Darling, this is Baron Stirling, our host for the evening." Sylvia extended her hand and allowed Stirling to bow over it.
"Baron Stirling, what a magnificent home. I can see why my husband speaks of you so frequently."
The line was perfectly chosen. flattering enough to please, vague enough to mean anything.
Sterling smiled and launched into a brief description of the auction catalogue, mentioning a set of Elizabethan silver candlesticks and a first-edition folio that he expected to fetch spirited bidding. Vane listened with practiced interest while his eyes moved across the room, cataloguing details. The layout matched what Sylvia had described from her research. The central ballroom opened through a set of double doors at the far end of the foyer, and the east wing corridor branched off to the right, past a gallery hung with tapestries and guarded by a single footman standing at the junction. The east wing led to the private quarters, and below those private quarters, accessible through a service staircase, lay the subterranean vault. One footman. That was the only barrier between the public areas of the house and the corridor Sylvia would need to reach. The auction began at 8:30. Sterling took his place at the front of the ballroom on a raised platform, presiding over the bidding with the confidence of a man who enjoyed being watched. The room filled with the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal, and the steady rhythm of the auctioneer's gavel as lot after lot was presented and sold. Vane waited until the bidding reached a particularly competitive lot, a pair of Ming Dynasty vases that had 3 earls practically climbing over each other to secure, and then excused himself from the row of gilt chairs. He found the master of security near the East Wing junction, a stout man with a military bearing and a ring of keys at his belt. Vane approached him with the easy authority of a man who was accustomed to speaking with servants as equals when it suited his purposes. "Remarkable estate," Vane said, gesturing at the tapestries lining the corridor. "I've always been fascinated by domestic security arrangements in houses of this scale. Tell me, how many men do you have positioned throughout the grounds tonight?" The security master, flattered by the attention of a duke, launched into an enthusiastic description of his deployment strategy. 12 men on the perimeter, 4 at the gates, 2 roving patrols in the gardens, and 3 stationed inside the house, 1 at the East Wing junction, 1 at the service entrance, and 1 at the wine cellar. As the security master talked, he shifted his position to face Vane more directly, turning his back to the East Wing corridor. The footman who had been standing at the junction, seeing his superior engaged in conversation with a guest, wandered a few steps closer to listen. The corridor behind them stood empty and unguarded. From across the foyer, Sylvia watched the gap open. She set down her champagne glass on a passing footman's tray, adjusted the pearl brooch at her throat, and moved toward the East Wing with the measured pace of a woman looking for a retiring room. She turned the corner and disappeared from view. The auction gavel cracked in the ballroom. The Ming vases sold for 800 guineas. The crowd erupted in polite applause, and the sound covered Sylvia's footsteps as she descended into the darkness below Stirling Manor. The service staircase was narrow, unlit, and built for function rather than comfort. Sylvia descended by touch, keeping one hand against the cold stone wall as the sounds of the auction faded above her. The stairs turned twice before ending at a short corridor lined with flagstones that were damp underfoot. The air down here was different, heavier, cooler, carrying the mineral smell of old stone and the faint tang of iron. A single oil lamp burned in a wall bracket at the far end of the corridor, casting a weak amber glow that barely reached the floor. By its light, Sylvia could see the vault door. It was exactly as Fenton had described. A reinforced iron door set into a stone archway, painted black, with a single keyhole positioned at chest height. No handle, no decorative flourishes, no indication of what lay behind it. The door was designed to look like nothing worth noticing, which was precisely the point. Sterling kept his wealth on display upstairs. Down here, he kept his secrets. Sylvia pulled the serpent key from the hidden pocket inside her gown. She had transferred it from the cloak lining earlier that evening, stitching a new pocket into the seam of the silk skirt with thread borrowed from the dressmaker's shop in Marlow. The key felt warm from resting against her body all evening,
and the iron serpent's coils pressed familiar grooves into her palm as she lifted it toward the lock.
She inserted the key slowly, feeling each tooth engage with the corresponding lever inside the mechanism.
This was the part her father had taught her to respect above all others, the moment when metal met metal and either obeyed or refused. A poorly cut key would jam at the third or fourth lever, and forcing it would trigger a deadbolt that would seal the door permanently. There would be no second attempt. First lever. Click. Second lever. Click. Third, fourth, fifth. Each one fell into alignment with a precision that sent a quiet surge of satisfaction through her chest. The final lever dropped, and the entire mechanism rotated with a deep grinding sound that she felt through the soles of her shoes. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, silent as a breath. The chamber beyond was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 12 feet square, with a low ceiling and walls lined with wooden shelving.
Boxes of documents were stacked on the upper shelves, each one labeled with a year and a letter code. A strongbox sat in one corner, padlocked with a heavy brass lock, and in the center of the room, mounted on a stone pedestal, stood the ledger cabinet. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, mahogany and brass, about 4 feet tall, with glass panels on the front that revealed rows of leather-bound volumes arranged by date. The cabinet door had a round brass dial set into its face, engraved with numbers from 0 to 9 around its circumference. The bypass lock. Sylvia pulled Vane's notebook from where she had tucked it into the folded edge of her glove. She opened it to the page with the 12-digit cipher and held it close to the oil lamp she had taken from the corridor wall bracket. 7, 3, 9, 1, 4, 8, 2, 6, 5, 0, 7, 3. She began turning the dial, aligning each number with the indicator mark at the top. The mechanism was beautifully engineered. Each digit produced a soft, satisfying click as it locked into position, and the dial moved with the smooth resistance of well-oiled steel. She worked through the sequence methodically, double-checking each number against the notebook before advancing to the next. The 11th digit clicked home. She turned to the 12th. 3. A pause. Then a sound from inside the cabinet, like a series of small hammers falling in sequence, and the glass-paneled door swung open. The ledgers were arranged chronologically, each one bound in dark brown leather with a year stamped in gold on the spine. Sylvia ran her fingers along the row until she found the volume she needed, the current year, thick with entries, its spine barely creased from use. She pulled it from the shelf and opened it on top of the pedestal. The pages were filled with Sterling's handwriting, the same tight, precise script she had seen on the bypass cipher card. Each entry recorded a loan transaction in meticulous detail. The borrower's name, the original terms, the actual interest rate agreed upon, and then, in a separate column on the right side of the page, the modified terms that appeared on the forged duplicate contracts. The evidence was devastating. Column after column showed the difference between what borrowers had actually signed and what Sterling's syndicate later claimed they had agreed to. Interest rates doubled, tripled, sometimes quadrupled. Repayment periods shortened from years to months. Collateral clauses added that the original borrowers had never seen, let alone consented to. Sylvia turned pages until she found it. Amsel. The Duke of Amsel's entry showed an original loan of £8,000 at 4% interest over 10 years. The modified version, the one Sterling's lawyers had used to demand £40,000 and threaten foreclosure, showed £30,000 at 12% over 3 years, with the entirety of the estate pledged as security. 2 pages further on, she found her father's name. George Hartwell, Master Engraver. Original loan, £200. Modified loan, £600 at ruinous terms. The entry that had destroyed her family's livelihood and ended her father's life was just 3 lines of ink
in a book full of identical crimes. She closed the ledger and tucked it under her arm. Then she shut the cabinet, spun the dial to scramble the combination, and turned toward the door. That was when she heard the footsteps. They were coming from the corridor above, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. The sound echoed down the stone staircase with a clarity that told her whoever was approaching was making no effort to be quiet.
A patrol guard, most likely, making rounds that were apparently ahead of schedule. Sylvia pulled the vault door nearly shut, leaving it open just wide enough to watch the bottom of the staircase through the crack. The footsteps reached the last turn and stopped. A lantern's glow appeared on the wall, stretching a long shadow across the flagstones. Then a voice. "Who left this lamp bracket empty? There's supposed to be a light at the end of this corridor." Sylvia's stomach dropped. The oil lamp. She had taken it from the wall to read the cipher and forgotten to replace it. A missing lamp was exactly the sort of small detail that a trained guard would notice during rounds. The shadow moved forward. The guard was coming down the final stretch of corridor, directly toward the vault. Above, in the gallery corridor, Vane saw the guard descend the staircase from the far end of the hallway.
He had been watching the East Wing entrance for the past 15 minutes, maintaining a position near a display of antique swords that gave him a clear sightline to the service stairs. When the guard's lantern disappeared below the staircase line, Vane moved. He reached the top of the stairs and stumbled deliberately, catching himself against the wall with a loud, clumsy impact. He let his body slide halfway down the first flight, knocking his shoulder against the stone with enough force to produce a convincing groan. "Good Lord," he called out, his voice carrying the thick, slurred quality of a man who had enjoyed far too much of his host's wine cellar. "Is there someone down here? I seem to have taken a wrong turn. I was looking for the retiring room, and these blasted corridors all look the same." The guard's footsteps stopped. His lantern swung back toward the staircase.
Sir, this area is private. You can't be down here."
Vane let the guard reach him, leaning heavily against the wall and blinking in the lantern light with the bewildered expression of a man who had misplaced both his dignity and his sense of direction. The guard took his arm and began steering him back up the stairs, lecturing him about restricted areas and proper guest conduct. Behind the vault door, Sylvia heard their footsteps retreat upward and fade. She waited 30 seconds, then slipped out, pulled the door shut, locked it with the serpent key, and replaced the oil lamp in its bracket. She was back in the foyer within 4 minutes, the ledger concealed beneath a cashmere shawl draped over her arm, a glass of champagne in her free hand, and an expression on her face that suggested she had spent the last 20 minutes doing nothing more interesting than admiring the tapestries. Vane found her standing near the grand staircase with the champagne glass untouched and the shawl folded carefully over her left arm. Their eyes met across 12 feet of marble floor, and in that single glance, an entire conversation passed between them. She gave the smallest possible nod. He adjusted his cufflink, twice, the agreed signal that meant it was time to leave. Sylvia set her champagne glass on the nearest surface and moved toward the foyer entrance with the unhurried grace of a woman who had simply grown tired of the evening's entertainment. Vane intercepted Sterling on his way out, which was the final necessary performance of the night. "Baron, I'm afraid my wife has developed one of her headaches. The excitement of the auction, I suspect. She's not accustomed to such late evenings. We'll be taking our leave." Sterling looked genuinely disappointed.
"So soon, Your Grace. The most interesting lots haven't even come up yet. I have a matched pair of Georgian dueling pistols that I expect will create quite a stir."
"Another time, perhaps. You must come to Amsel Manor when the weather turns. We'll have you for a weekend." Vane delivered the invitation with the same warmth he would offer a plate of food he had no intention of eating. Sterling accepted it with equal sincerity, and the two men shook hands in the manner of gentlemen who understood that politeness and honesty were entirely separate things. The footman brought their carriage around. Hargreaves had kept the horses harnessed and the carriage positioned near the edge of the drive, facing outward, exactly as Vane had instructed before they entered the house.
Sylvia climbed in first, keeping the shawl-wrapped ledger pressed against her side. Vane followed and pulled the door shut.
"Go," he said through the ceiling panel. "North Road. Do not stop for anything." Hargreaves needed no further encouragement. The whip cracked once above the horse's ears, and the carriage surged forward down the torchlit drive, past the queue of waiting coaches, through the iron gates, and onto the dark country road beyond. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Sylvia sat rigid in her seat, the ledger on her lap beneath the shawl, her breathing steady but shallow. Vane watched the rear window for lantern light or pursuing riders. The road behind them stayed dark. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of hooves on packed earth and the creak of the carriage springs as they swayed through turns. When 2 miles had passed, without any sign of pursuit, Sylvia exhaled and unwrapped the shawl.
The ledger lay between them on the seat, a thick volume of dark brown leather, heavy with the weight of hundreds of pages filled with Sterling's meticulous records. In the low glow of the carriage lamp, the gold lettering on the spine was clearly visible. The current year, stamped in a font that Sterling probably had custom-made. "Open it," Vane said. Sylvia opened the ledger to the section she had found in the vault. The Amsel entry was near the front, filed under the letter A. She turned the book so Vane could read it, holding the page flat with her fingertips. Vane studied the columns in silence. The original terms of his father's loan were written in Sterling's own hand, £8,000 at 4% over 10 years. A manageable debt, a reasonable arrangement. The kind of terms a proud man like his father might have accepted to cover a temporary shortfall in estate income during a bad harvest year. And beside it, in the right-hand column, the forged version. £30,000 at 12% over 3 years, with Amsel Nana pledged as full collateral. The handwriting was identical, Sterling had been careful, but the terms bore no resemblance to the original agreement. His father had borrowed £8,000. Sterling's lawyers were demanding £40,000, including accumulated interest on a principal that had been fabricated from nothing. Vane stared at the page for a long time. His jaw worked slowly, and his hands rested on his knees with the kind of deliberate stillness that a man holds when the alternative is putting his fist through the nearest wall. "He signed his own name to the forgery," Vane said quietly. "Both columns, the original terms and the modified terms, side by side, in the same book, in the same hand. He kept a perfect record of every lie he ever told."
"He had to," Sylvia said. "Sterling operates through dozens of agents and solicitors across the country. The only way to keep track of which version of each contract was real and which was fabricated was to maintain a master record. This ledger is his control document. Without it, even his own people wouldn't know which debts were legitimate."
Vane turned the pages forward, scanning entry after entry. The names were staggering in their variety. Country squires, merchant families, minor nobility, tradesmen, widows managing inherited estates. Each one showed the same pattern. Reasonable original terms transformed into crushing obligations through the stroke of a pen. "There must be 200 entries in this volume alone," Vane said. "This is 1 year. The cabinet held volumes going back at least 15 years, but this one is enough. It contains the current active forgeries, including yours and my father's. It's the evidence we need." Vane closed the ledger and placed both hands flat on its cover, as if he were swearing an oath on it. "We take this to the High Magistrate in Highford. Chief Justice Pemberton sits there, and he's one of the few men in the judicial system that Sterling hasn't managed to buy or intimidate. If we present this evidence before Sterling discovers the ledger is missing, he won't have time to destroy his duplicate records or flee the country." "How long do we have?" Vane calculated. The auction would continue until the early hours of the morning.
Sterling would be occupied with his guests until at least 2 o'clock, and likely wouldn't visit the vault until the following day, when the event was concluded and the house was cleared. That gave them a window of perhaps 8 to 10 hours.
Highford is 4 hours north by fast carriage, Vane said. If we ride through the night without stopping, we can be at the magistrate's chambers by dawn. The court opens at 9. We present the ledger, file a formal complaint, and request an immediate injunction against Sterling's assets before he even knows we're there. Sylvia leaned back against the seat. The tension that had held her body tight as a bowstring since they entered Sterling Manor was beginning to loosen, replaced by something that looked almost like disbelief.
4 years, she said softly. 4 years since my father died. 3 months of planning, 11 weeks scrubbing floors, and now it's sitting on the seat of a carriage, heading north at midnight.
It's not finished yet, Vane said.
Sterling is powerful, connected, and ruthless. The moment he discovers the ledger is gone, he will use every resource at his disposal to recover it and silence anyone involved. We are safe only as long as we are ahead of him.
Then we stay ahead. Hargreaves pushed the horses harder through the darkness, and the carriage ate up the miles of empty road between Buckinghamshire and Highford. The countryside rolled past in black shapes, hedgerows, farmhouses, church steeples silhouetted against a sky full of stars that had finally broken through the clouds. Dawn found them crossing the stone bridge over the River Wye on the outskirts of Highford, with the ledger wrapped in Sylvia's shawl, the serpent key hidden in its pocket, and the spires of the provincial courthouse rising above the rooftops ahead of them like a promise that had taken 4 years to keep. The courthouse at Highford was a building designed to make ordinary people feel small. 4 stories of grey Portland stone, fronted by a colonnade of Doric columns and approached by a flight of 30 steps that forced every visitor to climb upward as if seeking permission from the architecture itself. The windows were tall and narrow, set deep into the facade, and the main doors were made of English oak reinforced with iron bands that had turned black with age. Above the entrance, carved into the stone lintel in Roman capitals, were the words Justitia et Veritas, justice and truth. Vane had been inside this building twice before in his life. Once as a boy, accompanying his father to a land dispute hearing, and once 3 years ago to contest the first round of Sterling's foreclosure claims. He had lost that contest. The solicitor Sterling had sent to represent the trust had produced documents so convincing that the presiding judge had dismissed Vane's objections within the hour. That memory still carried a bitter taste, and Vane swallowed it down as he climbed the steps with Sylvia beside him and the ledger tucked beneath his arm, wrapped in the cashmere shawl. The court clerks began arriving at 8:30, grey-faced men in dark coats who carried bundles of papers and spoke to each other in the hushed tones of people who spent their professional lives surrounded by trouble. Vane approached the senior clerk at the main reception desk and presented his card. I require an immediate private audience with Chief Justice Pemberton. The matter is urgent and concerns evidence of widespread financial fraud. The clerk examined the card, noted the ducal title, and disappeared through a side door. He returned 4 minutes later and led Vane and Sylvia through a series of paneled corridors to a chamber at the rear of the building. Chief Justice Pemberton was a man of about 60, with a broad, weathered face that belonged more to a farmer than a judge. He had thick, white eyebrows, heavy hands that rested on his desk like a pair of sleeping animals, and eyes that gave the impression they had heard every possible variety of lie and had grown tired of the entire exercise. He wore his judicial robes loosely, as though comfort mattered more to him than ceremony, and he did not stand when Vane and Sylvia entered. Your Grace, Pemberton said, my clerk tells me you have evidence of fraud. Sit down and show me what you've brought. I have a full docket this morning and very little patience for anything that wastes the court's time. Vane set the ledger on Pemberton's desk and opened it to the Amsel entry. He explained the 2-column system,
original terms on the left, forged terms on the right, and walked the judge through the specific discrepancies in his family's loan documents. Pemberton listened without interrupting, his thick eyebrows drawing closer together with each page Vane turned. Then Sylvia spoke. She described her father's case, the original loan of £200, the fabricated second contract, the seizure of the workshop, and her father's death in a Southwark boarding house. She explained how she had gained access to Sterling's offices, how the key had been made, and how the bypass cipher had been obtained from Sterling's private coach.
Pemberton raised one hand.
You're telling me this ledger was removed from Baron Sterling's private vault without his knowledge or consent?
Yes, my lord. That is theft, young woman, regardless of what the ledger contains. Vane leaned forward. My lord, if a man locks stolen property inside his own vault, does recovering that property constitute theft? Every entry in this book represents a forged contract, a document that was fabricated to defraud the original borrower. The ledger itself is evidence of a crime, and leaving it in Sterling's possession would have guaranteed its destruction the moment he suspected anyone was looking for it. Pemberton studied Vane for a long moment, then pulled the ledger closer and began reading the entries himself, page by page, running his finger down the columns with the slow deliberation of a man who understood numbers and did not trust anyone else's interpretation of them. 10 minutes passed. Pemberton turned pages. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Sylvia sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, and Vane resisted the urge to speak further because he understood that this was a man who would reach his own conclusions in his own time and resented being pushed toward them. Finally, Pemberton closed the ledger and placed both palms flat on its cover.
There are 217 active entries in this volume. If even a quarter of them are substantiated by comparison with the filed contracts held by the borrowers, this is the largest case of systematic financial fraud this court has seen in 30 years. He looked up at Vane. I will issue an immediate order to impound Baron Sterling's assets and seal his offices pending a full judicial investigation. The ledger will be entered into evidence under court seal. No one, including Sterling's solicitors, will be permitted to access or challenge it until the investigation is complete. The door to Pemberton's chamber opened before Vane could respond, and the senior clerk stepped inside with an expression that had gone from grey to white. My lord, Baron Sterling is in the main hall. He is demanding to see you immediately. He has 2 solicitors and 4 of his private guards with him. The room went still. Sylvia's hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles whitening beneath her gloves.
Vane felt his pulse climb, but kept his expression level. Pemberton did not look alarmed. He looked annoyed, which on a judge of his seniority and temperament was far more dangerous for the person causing the annoyance. Show him in, Pemberton said. His guards stay outside. If any of them sets foot past the threshold, have the court bailiffs remove them. Sterling entered the chamber like a man who owned it. He was still wearing his evening clothes from the auction, slightly rumpled from what must have been a hard overnight ride, and his face carried the cold, controlled fury of someone who was accustomed to destroying problems before they had a chance to grow. His eyes found Sylvia immediately.
That woman, Sterling said, pointing one long finger across the room, broke into my private property and stole confidential financial documents. I demand her immediate arrest and the return of my belongings.
Pemberton looked at Sterling the way a man might look at a dog that had jumped onto the dining table during supper. Baron Sterling, you are standing in a judicial chamber, and you will address this court with appropriate respect or you will be removed from it. Sit down. Sterling sat. His jaw was rigid, and his pale blue eyes moved between Vane, Sylvia, and the ledger on Pemberton's desk with the rapid calculation of a man watching his empire crack from the foundation upward.
I have examined the ledger in question, Pemberton continued. It contains what appears to be a comprehensive record of loan modifications carried out by your financial trust, in which the original terms agreed upon by borrowers were
systematically altered to their severe disadvantage. The modifications bear your personal seal and your handwriting. Do you deny authorship?" Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Sylvia had watched him from across a scrubbing brush on the floors of his Oakhaven offices, she saw genuine fear pass across his face. It lasted only a moment before the mask of composure returned, but it was there, and it was real. "I deny that any documents removed from my property without authorization can be considered admissible evidence in any court proceeding." "That determination is mine to make, Baron, and I have made it." Pemberton turned to his clerk. "Issue an impoundment order on all assets held by the Sterling Financial Trust, effective immediately. Dispatch officers to Sterling's offices in Oakhaven and his estate in High Wycombe to secure all records before anything can be moved or destroyed, and void every active debt instrument issued by the Trust until the original terms can be verified against this ledger." Sterling rose from his chair. "You cannot do this. I will appeal to the Lord Chancellor himself." "You are welcome to try," Pemberton said evenly. "In the meantime, your assets are frozen, your offices are sealed, and every family you have defrauded over the past 20 years will be notified that their debts are under judicial review." Sterling turned to Vane. The look he gave him was something beyond anger. It was the expression of a man who had spent decades building a fortress of paper and ink, and had just watched a stranger carry the foundation stone out the front door. He said nothing further. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his solicitors trailing behind him like attendants following a king who had just lost his throne. The door closed. The room was quiet. Pemberton looked at Sylvia. "You took a considerable risk, young woman." "I had considerable reason, my lord." The judge held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once and returned to his paperwork, the ledger sitting on his desk beneath the seal of the court, locked away from the man who had written it, and the empire it was about to dismantle. The letter from Pemberton's court arrived 6 days later. It came by special courier on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young man on a chestnut horse who rode up the long drive to Amsel Manor with a leather dispatch bag strapped across his chest and the judicial seal of Highford stamped on every document inside it. Vane received him in the front hall, signed for the package, and carried it to the library, where Sylvia was sitting at the desk, reviewing a stack of household accounts she had begun organizing the day after they returned from Highford. She had not left the estate since then. There had been nowhere else to go. Her father's workshop was long since sold, the boarding house in Southwark held nothing for her, and the small room she had rented in Oakhaven while working as a cleaning woman in Sterling's offices had been abandoned the night she climbed into Vane's carriage. Amsel Manor, for the moment, was the only place in England where she was both safe and welcome. And she had filled the waiting days by making herself useful in the way she knew best, studying systems, identifying problems, and fixing things that had been neglected for too long. Vane opened the dispatch bag and spread the documents across the library table. There were 4 separate items. He read each one in order, his expression shifting by degrees from concentration to something that looked remarkably like relief. The first document confirmed that the High Court had formally accepted the ledger as primary evidence in a case of systematic financial fraud against the Sterling Financial Trust. The investigation was being conducted under Pemberton's direct supervision, and preliminary findings had already corroborated the discrepancies in over 60 of the 217 entries. The second document was a judicial order voiding all outstanding debts issued by the Sterling Trust that could not be verified against the original terms recorded in the ledger. The order covered every active loan, every foreclosure proceeding, and every pending seizure of property connected to Sterling's syndicate. Amsel Manor was listed specifically on page 3, paragraph 7, with a note confirming that the original loan of £8,000 had been repaid in full by the late Duke's estate 2 years prior to his death. The foreclosure claim was void. The estate was free. Vane read that paragraph twice,
Then he set the document down and pressed his hand flat against the table, as if he needed to confirm that the wood beneath his fingers was real and solid and still belonged to him. The third document listed the assets impounded from Sterling's holdings. His offices in Oakhaven had been sealed and their contents transferred to court storage.
His country estate in High Wycombe had been placed under judicial administration. His personal accounts at 3 London banks had been frozen, and the man himself had been confined to his London townhouse under court supervision, forbidden from travelling, conducting business, or contacting any of the individuals named in the ledger. The fourth document was shorter than the others. It was a formal notice from the Highford Court addressed to Miss Sylvia Hartwell, confirming that the fraudulent loan modification pertaining to Mr. George Hartwell, master engraver, had been identified and voided. The original debt of £200 had been marked as fully discharged, and all property and assets seized under the falsified terms were subject to a restitution order pending valuation. Sylvia read the notice standing up, holding it with both hands. The workshop was gone, sold years ago to a printing firm that had since remodeled the entire building. The tools had been scattered to pawnshops and second-hand dealers across London. There would be no going back to the life her father had built, because that life had been dismantled piece by piece and could not be reassembled from money alone. But the record was corrected. The forged contract that had destroyed George Hartwell carried a judicial stamp declaring it void and fraudulent. Her father's name, which had been dragged through the machinery of Sterling's empire and ground down to nothing, had been restored. The tremor in the forged signature, the one detail that had told Sylvia the truth when no one else would listen, had finally been seen by eyes with the authority to act on it. She folded the notice carefully and placed it inside the cover of a small leather journal she had been carrying since Oakhaven. It was her father's work journal, the one he had used to record measurements, commissions, and the fine technical sketches that made his engravings the most precise in Cheapside. She had kept it through every room she had rented, every floor she had scrubbed, and every night she had spent planning the operation that had led her to this library, in this house, on this particular morning.
"Walk with me," Vane said. They left the library through the French doors that opened onto the rear terrace. Amsel Manor's gardens stretched out before them in the mid-morning light, 3 acres of landscaped grounds that had been designed by Vane's grandmother and maintained with varying degrees of success ever since. The rose beds were overgrown, the gravel paths needed raking, and the ornamental fountain at the center of the lawn had gone dry sometime during the previous summer.
But the bones of the garden were sound, and the old oak trees that lined the southern boundary stood as thick and steady as they had for 100 years. They walked in silence for a while, following the path that curved around the fountain and down toward a stone bench set beneath the largest of the oaks. The morning air carried the smell of cut grass and damp earth, and somewhere in the hedgerow a blackbird was singing with the enthusiastic persistence of a creature that had no debts, no enemies, and no particular plans for the afternoon. Vane sat on the bench. Sylvia remained standing, looking out across the grounds with an expression that was difficult to read. "What will you do now?" Vane asked. She considered the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead. The last 3 months of my life have been organized around a single objective, and now that it's done, the days ahead feel rather formless. I suppose I'll return to London and look for work. There are engraving firms that might take on someone with my training, though most of them prefer to hire men."
"I have a different suggestion," Vane said. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the dry fountain and the overgrown rose beds and the general condition of an estate that had spent 2 years under the shadow of foreclosure, with its owner too distracted by legal battles to attend to its management.
"This estate has not had a proper administrator since my father's steward retired 4 years ago. The accounts are disordered, the tenant agreements need renegotiating. The farm yields have dropped because nobody has been coordinating the seasonal planning, And, as you can see, the grounds have suffered considerably. I need someone with an eye for systems, a head for numbers, and the ability to look at a complicated problem and take it apart piece by piece until it makes sense." He paused. "You broke into the most heavily guarded private vault in the south of England, using a key you forged from memory, a cipher you copied from a moving carriage, and a disguise you assembled in 2 days. I think you can manage a country estate." Sylvia looked at him. The morning light caught the pearl brooch she was still wearing at her collar, the one that had belonged to his mother, the one he had never asked her to return. "You're offering me a position. I'm offering you a partnership. Chief Administrator and Financial Manager of Amsel Manor. Full authority over the estate's operations, a salary commensurate with the role, and permanent quarters in the East Wing. You would answer to me in name and to no one in practice, because we both know you're better with numbers than I am, and pretending otherwise would be a waste of both our time." The blackbird in the hedgerow finished its song and started again from the beginning, as if the first performance had been merely a rehearsal. Sylvia sat down on the bench beside him. She looked at the garden, at the manor house rising behind them with its ivy-covered walls and its windows catching the sun, and at the oak tree above them, whose roots had been holding this particular patch of English soil together since long before either of them was born. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it."
"Fix the fountain. A proper estate should have a working fountain." Something crossed Vane's face that might have been the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in 2 years.
"Consider it done, Miss Hartwell."
They shook hands on the bench beneath the oak, the same firm, single handshake they had exchanged in a firelit room at the Bramble Inn 5 days earlier. The terms were different now. The stakes were quieter. But the foundation was the same. 2 people who had walked into each other's lives through a carriage door on a rainy night and discovered that trust, once earned in the dark, holds up remarkably well in the daylight. Behind them, Amsel Manor stood in the morning sun with its debts erased, its future open, and its gardens waiting patiently for the attention they had been promised.